Slavery is an inconvenient history for the Brazilian elite. There is no doubt about that.
Brazil was built on the back of the largest forced migration in history. North America is well known for its slave-owning past, but this South American country received 10 times as many, 4 million Africans. The lands that stretched before the Portuguese were larger than Europe. It was a remarkable discovery, equaling that of Columbus only 8 years earlier. The Portuguese eagerly sent the news home to Lisbon. Lisbon, Portugal's capital, was the world's center of exploration. Its streets full of sailors, investors, traders, and adventurers. This new continent seemed to contain little obvious wealth. There were no gold-clad Aztecs or Incas to conquer. The only item of interest was a valuable tree, known in Europe as Brazil wood, which gave the country its new name. But there was nothing to compare with the wealth of Asia. Except for one thing, its land. Portugal sectioned off Brazil's coastline to rich settlers, but they soon ran into a problem. Plantations are highly labor-intensive, and Portugal's own population was too small to send suitable emigrants. The ambitious new settlers turned to slavery. Portugal, like most of Europe, was no stranger to slavery. 1 in 10 of Lisbon's population was a slave, predominantly from northern Africa. So, all along the Brazilian coast, native Indians found themselves being bribed with their first iron tools or forced at gunpoint to become enslaved. Above all, hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples died from European diseases, smallpox, measles, and the common cold. A plantation could see its workforce of hundreds reduced to a handful in a week. In under 100 years, a population of 4 million Indians was halved. So by the year 1600, the Portuguese, requiring an alternative labor force, had turned to Africa. Portugal had recently colonized southwest Africa, including modern Angola.
Transportation of slaves was very much like that. Perhaps 300 or 400 people packed together with only enough space to lie down, without enough air, without enough water, without enough food to survive. Very often, over half of the cargo, as it were lost from these voyages.
And so Brazil becomes the great slave-using colony.
What exactly were these slaves being used for? What was the commodity that caused the Portuguese to colonize these lands as quickly as they could? Sugar was Brazilian gold.
People were making fortunes, huge amounts of money, out of the business of sugar.
We often tend to think of slaves just working in the fields, but obviously they worked as carpenters, as builders, and in various other occupations as well. They'd probably work from sunrise to sunset, sometimes 18 or 20 hours a day. It was said that slaves only needed 3 things: bread, cloth, and a stick. In other words, a stick to be beaten with, enough bread to survive, and just a strip of cloth in terms of clothing.
Plantation owners often lived like lords. Their slaves lived less well. The system was barbarous. Punishments were severe: being placed in the stocks, being castrated, or execution. Most common by far was whipping.
The accused receives 200 or 300 lashes. The mangled flesh is then cut and pepper and salt applied to the wounds. The tourniquet, hand and neck stocks, thumbscrews, manacles, irons, pillories, and many other instruments of punishment are common on our plantations. In some provinces, slaves are exposed for a whole night, tied to a stake over an ant's nest. Burlamak, abolitionist.
One day, someone came to visit him and told him how attractive a female slave's breasts were. To please the visitor, as he was leaving, the Baron handed him the slave's breasts on a tray.
Whereas in the United States the black population rose steadily, in Brazil, despite a far greater rate of importation, it stayed the same. Life expectancy for new arrivals was a mere 6 or 7 years, and slaves born in Brazil lived, on average, only into their early 20s. And who were the settlers? Many were young men, or ambitious gamblers, risking all, who found themselves thrown into a world of wealth, freedom, fornication. Many, too, were criminals or miscreants that Portugal preferred far from home shores. The majority of imported slaves were male. Women were few, children not valued.
Slave women deliberately attempt to abort themselves so that the children inside their bodies will not be made to suffer what they have suffered. Antonil, Jesuit priest.
The need for slaves multiplied enormously when, in the mid-1690s, gold was discovered in the interior. Slaves were sent to the mines to dig, pan, and extract more wealth for their masters. Brazil's increasing prosperity was channeled into new towns and cities. As Portugal's population remained small, continuing to send few immigrants, and other Europeans preferred the cooler climate and Protestant faith of North America, it was Brazil's black slaves that built and serviced this urban colonization.
It was the slaves who ran the city. They were the traders, they were the population, everything. They even managed the city's waste. Tigers were the slaves who carried excrement. The city didn't have sewers, and the excrement was thrown on the beaches.
Prostitutes found easy clients among the white settlers. The Portuguese were far from home and family, and the indigenous Indian women and black slave women were both targets for sexual liaison.
In the early days, Portugal was such a tiny country with only just over 1 million people, and setting out to colonize practically half the world, or convert it. So it's just crazy what they were trying to do. So their official instructions to people in the early years in Brazil were just to breed up as much as they could.
In Brazil, the colonization was essentially male. The Portuguese woman, the family, did not come to Brazil. You can count on one hand the number of European women, in contrast with the number of European men. So, the biological integration of the African woman with the European man was natural. There wasn't this ethnic exclusiveness that took place in the United States.
The sharp distinction between white master and black slave began to blur in a country where white men, born either in Portugal or Brazil itself, had little choice but to mix with non-white women.
The Portuguese differ enormously from the British in the whole colonial enterprise. There were different forms of domination, whereas the British, at least towards the end of the 19th century, bitten by what was then called scientific racism, divided people up according to their supposed race and prohibited contact between them, and encouraged the development of racial communities. The Portuguese did not do this. I mean, they did to a certain extent, but much less.
The extent of sexual relations between master and slave led to thousands of mixed-race children. Some were made heirs. Most were made slaves. These churches were both built and decorated by slaves. Pointedly, some quietly rebelled by sculpting pregnant angels. Many slaves did not adhere wholly or at all to Catholicism. They fought hard to maintain their traditional beliefs, to follow their own saints. Slave masters could not prevent their workers from keeping this link to an African past. Some owners actually declared it helped to keep their slaves happy and diverted from the monotony of their labors. Music and dance became an inextricable part of a developing Brazilian identity.
One of the outstanding differences between Brazil and the U.S. South is simply the fact that not only more slaves came to Brazil than to the U.S. South, but they continued to come for a longer period of time and later into the 19th century. So that there was a constant renewal of Africans and of African culture to Brazil. It was more reinforced and fresher in the Brazilian experience. And so they brought with them that cultural heritage. And it's ironic that today some of that is better preserved in Brazil than it is in Africa, because change continued to happen in Africa to erode those forms.
Other slaves expressed their discontent by fleeing. But to where?
Slaves who ran away joined runaway communities called quilombos. And even cities, even the city of Rio de Janeiro was ringed by quilombos established in the forests, in the hills, quite nearby. And some of these became, had a long life that were more or less independent. They were always the object of police attempts to break them up.
Within Brazil itself, larger and larger numbers of slaves were simply abandoning plantations, wrecking the whole system. Plantation owners decided to opt for abolition and hoped they could coerce some slaves to stay on. On the 13th of May, 1888, the Princess Regent Isabel proclaimed the so-called Aurea Law. Brazil became the last major country officially to abolish slavery.
It's true that this was the final Emancipation Act, but of course even after that, those who had formerly been slaves owned nothing, were given no compensation, so on, and so were forced to remain on the land or to exist in other ways. In other words, although they were legally free, they were still bound economically to the land, to the mines, or the other occupations they were forced.
The blacks are the ones in prisons, living in the slums, not having jobs. Nowadays, they're not slaves belonging to one master. They are slaves of the system.
Following abolition, there was a deliberate policy to draw in white settlers, Italians, Germans, Spaniards. As Brazil commemorates its 500th birthday, no other country shares its racial mix. The delineation between black and white is blurred, with the overwhelming majority somewhere in the middle. But white remains the color of aspiration, and black the color of a history that some would prefer to forget.